So the psychiatrist Dr. Lewin Brizendine wrote in her book, The Female Brain, she says, picture for a moment a map showing the areas for emotion in the brains of the two sexes. In the man's brain, the connecting routes between areas would be country roads. In the woman's brains, they would be superhighways. According to researchers at the University of Michigan, women use both sides of the brain to respond to emotional experiences, while men just use one. They found the connections between the emotion centers are also more active and extensive in women. And then in another study at Stanford, volunteers viewed emotional images while having their brains scanned. 9 different brain areas lit up in women, but only 2 lit up in men. Research also shows that women typically remember emotional events such as first dates, vacations, big arguments more vividly and retain them longer than men. Women will know what he said, what they both ate, if it was cold outside or if it rained on their anniversary, while men may forget everything except whether or not she looked sexy.
This explains why when we did that documentary type thing with Marriage Helper about our marriage, and there was one question that the videographers asked us, because we did it separately, like they interviewed you, then they interviewed me. So they interviewed you and they asked, what was your wedding day like? And you were like, oh, it was good.
Yeah, it was good.
And then they asked me, what was your wedding day like? And I was like, well, I was sick with the flu. I was throwing up that morning. It was cold outside and snowing. And they laughed after my super in-depth response. And they said, all Rob said was, it was good.
It was good.
It was good. So emotions, that's what we're talking about on today's episode. So the difference between how men and women process emotions.
Yes, there's a lot of difference. There's so much difference that, not to get into controversy, but I am confounded when I hear some younger people say that, it's all a social construct, the differences between
emotions.
The differences between men and women and how we operate. And it's like, no, there are absolutely innate differences, and that shouldn't be a politically incorrect thing to say. I think they're beautiful differences. If I were to make a list of what I view as women's brain superpowers and then men's brain superpowers, I would prefer women's. So when we're talking, let's do that for a second. Let's make a little mental chart in our minds. Let's talk first about women's mental superpowers. So the areas of a woman's brain designated for reading nonverbal communication in other people is 2 to 3 times larger. So a woman can read body language, voice inflection, and things much more sharply. A woman's ability so there's that social intuition, if you will. But a woman's ability to have those emotional events seared into her memory is orders of magnitude greater than a man as well. So an emotionally significant event will stick in a woman's memory longer and be more distinct and have more detail. On the man side of the house for mental superpowers, we have slightly faster processing of geometric shapes, particularly 3-dimensional.
So why does that matter?
That's why I'm saying I prefer the women's superpowers. So we're a bit faster. This is after puberty. So before puberty, you won't see a difference in children, male, female processing, let's say Tetris, or let's say if you had a 3D Tetris, the boys and girls would be the same. After puberty, so after middle school, you'll see a divergence where the boys start to process it approximately twice as fast. However, the girls, while they're slower, they're just as accurate with all that stuff. Not entirely sure why. This might be part of the root origins why men tend to go into STEM and women go in at very lower rates. It's not that women aren't capable of doing all the STEM stuff. They're often just less interested. An addendum to that is that when they trained young girls who were post-pubescent to start processing the 3D shapes with their hands and hand motions, they then started to process just as fast as the boys. They just had to be trained to do it.
Yeah.
So that superpower then became moot.
Yeah.
The other superpower men have is that during life-threatening emergencies, the amygdala is, I think, 8 times more active. However, during normal day-to-day stress, it's less active. So if
The
you
amygdala.
notice,
And the amygdala is basically what controls, this is like a gross interpretation, but it's basically what controls the fight or flight. So what you're saying is men in a super high stress, quote unquote, life-threatening situation, they tend to process what's happening and make a decision of what to do about it quicker. But in a day-to-day normal life, that women tend to be able to assess things and move quicker. So some of the ways that this has come up within our conversations that we have, I'm a more anxious person than you are. I'm also, it is so true that I'm way more in tune with social cues and general concern about like what people think, how people react, like noticing those things and worrying about those if I feel like people aren't happy, or if, what if we did something to offend them or whatever. And so we've definitely had several conversations where I come to you with like, oh, I'm really concerned that we may have offended these people. We said this and they said that. I can't think of a specific example, but, and your response is typically something along the lines of, yeah, that's how your brain is wired. Like women tend to be more socially wired because social support for a woman historically and evolutionarily, not that we believe in evolution, but we believe in, the fact that that humans have been around for thousands of years, and we tend to
mating adaptations over time
yeah,
steer people in a certain direction.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's what we were taught by. It's how we're wired. It's how we're wired and how we're taught to live in society. So, and women, I mean, in societies where it was more of that hunter-gatherer type thing, women definitely needed a support system of other women. And they did not want to be the outcast of that because it would take away their ability to live.
Being a social, so in a historical and prehistorical setting, whether that be hunter-gatherer, medieval, or even 1800s like the Wild West, being a social pariah will have a far greater impact on the quality of life of a woman and her children than it would for a man. Simply put. Therefore, it totally stands to reason that women are, I would actually say, more socially adept just naturally. Doesn't mean that men, especially, and Dr. Brizendine notes that especially as men get older, their social intelligence really does start to catch up. And I have felt that here in my 30s, that I'm actually paying attention to people's facial expressions, their body language, their voice inflection in ways that I never did when I was younger. I never cared about. And when I first started processing these things, it was conscious, and then over time it becomes unconscious.
So you're training yourself
Yes.
to be more aware of social cues from others.
And the good news, men, you can train yourself, and ladies, you can train yourself to do just about anything. When they look at they do brain scans of London cabbie drivers. So taxi cab drivers in London. There is a test that they have to take, the 5-year mark of being a cabbie. It is all the road names. It's basically a mental map of the city of London. London is a big city. So to memorize and have a mental map of London in your head is just crazy to me. They've done brain scans of the guys who passed the test versus the ones who failed the test. The ones who passed the test have the area of their brain for like geo-mapping is significantly larger. The men who fail the test because they haven't been studying or whatever, it's significantly smaller. So we can grow the areas of our brain responsible for interpreting all the things that women get naturally, right? Being able to read tone of voice, body language, facial expressions, all those things. We can learn that over time. We probably won't be quite as good. I like to joke that just now at the age of 37, I'm about as socially intelligent as a 15 or 16-year-old girl. Like that's the joke. Like I'm getting there. So yeah, when we talk about superpowers, mental superpowers of women versus men, I kind of prefer women's. But we've got what we got, and we can improve upon what we've got. There are some drawbacks. You mentioned anxiety and depression. Women suffer from anxiety, I think, at 4 times the rate that men do. The reason for that is, and again, we go back to the amygdala, being hyper aware of existential threats in your environment, many of which are social. Men feel far less threatened by social things. It's just less of a threat. Think about it from a prehistorical context. If a man were cast out of his tribe or village, he wanders around till he finds another one. And he hunts and stuff until he gets there. The likelihood of him dying is greater with him being by himself, but it's not so much greater. If a woman were cast out, especially if she were cast out with her children, life expectancy is very low. Very low. So it stands to reason that when you look at the way men and women operate, women suffering from anxiety and by extension depression, I don't fully understand the relationship, but I know that anxiety and depression, many of the same areas of the brain and many of the same neurochemicals are at play, which segues into depression, which stinks. So there is kind of that drawback. You know, you have some superpowers that are just like phenomenal, but then there's some drawbacks that go with it in the form of anxiety and depression. When we talk about women's intuition, I like this one. I was reading a book one time. I don't remember the title of it. The author, I think he had a master's degree in engineering or something. It wasn't psychology. And toward the beginning of the book, I'm glad I caught this at the beginning. He mentioned the myth of female intuition or women's intuition. And based on all the readings I've done up to that point, I'm like, well, I know that's not true. It's not a myth. We're talking about a real thing here. I shut the book, didn't waste my time reading it, and I moved on, right? So knowing all that about women's intuition, women's gut feelings. So let's talk about that. So because of higher levels of estrogen, women will have gut feelings and they will also have physical pain, and they'll feel it much more pronounced than men will. The ability to read faces and the tone of voice by extension is going to be heightened because of some of that. An extension of that is emotional congruence that women feel with other people, or empathy. Does that make sense? Mirroring?
No. So go back. How does this have to do with estrogen?
Estrogen simply means that you will feel gut feelings and physical pain more pronounced.
Do you know why?
Estrogen. That's all I got. That's
so
all I know.
Because women have estrogen, and not only women have estrogen, men have estrogen too, but we just have it to a higher percentage in our bodies than what men have. So because we have that, we tend to feel pain more.
Yes, as well as gut feelings.
So kind of like sensory input. We have a higher acclimation or we have a higher propensity of sensory input in our bodies.
Yes.
Okay. And so because of that.
So that actually does a lot of things. So we already talked about the ability to read faces, tone of voice, emotional nuance. We already mentioned at the beginning in that quote, when you think of the way women process and store emotional memory. So there's processing emotion, but just like a computer, you have processing power, then you have memory. There's also the way that women go about storing emotional memory. Imagine a superhighway. And if the storage facilities are like warehouses, we're talking about like fulfillment by Amazon warehouses here, with little robots driving around very efficiently, robotically, putting everything where it's supposed to be. Compare that to a man's emotional brain. It's like country roads. You know, we've got John Denver singing West Virginia. And the emotional storage centers are kind of like tiny little warehouses that aren't all that impressive. You might take a look at it and be like, really? That's a warehouse? And it's not efficient. It's like Bubba in the back, and he works part-time, and he'll put emotional memories on the shelf sometimes, and they'll fall off at other times.
Whereas women are like Inside Out.
Yes. The movie Inside Out is actually, it's pretty good. So let's talk about emotional empathy, mirroring emotional congruence. Women have it a lot more.
Yeah, I believe that. I think it's weird though, because a lot of people think the father of talk therapy was Sigmund Freud, but but not really. The talk therapy that we know as it is was Carl Rogers. And he really took the idea of to be successful as a therapist is to show empathy and to be that ever-present, non-wavering person for your client. And he was a man. And at the beginning, it was mostly men that really pioneered talk therapy as we know it today. So I do think it's interesting in that respect. There's definitely men that are very good at this, and they're good at empathy and mirroring. My dad is great. I mean, he is one of the first people that I go to when I'm anxious or when I'm upset, because he knows how to listen, how to calm me down, how to be present and a part of it. Whereas sometimes you struggle with that. Where you'll say, it'll be fine, or you don't have to worry about it.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm like, no, I'm worried about it, and I need someone to like be present with me.
Only half the house is on fire, okay? We're in the half that's not on fire.
So we don't need to worry about it.
I think we've got at least 20 minutes more of video game playing time before I need to evacuate.
But age might have something to do with that. I mean, my dad has had a lot of wisdom and a lot of experience and a lot of just general times where he's had to be that listening ear. And so, when he was 37, maybe he wasn't as empathetic. I don't know. Also, estrogen probably goes up more for men as they age, I don't know. I'm wondering, as testosterone begins to decrease.
Generally speaking, so the ratio of estrogen in a man as he ages may go up a bit. It goes up when you get fatter, simply put. If you stay healthy and you work out and all those things and you keep a pretty low body fat percentage, your estrogen, the ratio of estrogen to testosterone probably won't change much in your life. As you age, let's say you get a little rounder, a little softer, the adipose tissue, the fat will cause an increase in what's called aromatization, which is where it converts testosterone to estrogen. So that rate may go up, and yet the overall serum testosterone levels go down.
Yeah.
So the ratio of estrogen to testosterone may increase with age, and it will in many men. And that is kind of a natural part of things. Whether or not that will innately give a man a greater emotional intelligence, I think depends on the man and how much he actually wants to develop that and tries to develop that.
Yeah.
You can plot me into a Spanish-speaking country, and because I have a voracious desire to learn another language, it'll probably be 6 months to a year before I'm conversational. But if I had zero desire, a complete lack of desire to learn another language, I probably wouldn't learn very much. So I would compare it to that. It's a desire to learn and a desire to improve. If it's there, I think someone likely will, as long as they're given the tools.
Yeah. So clearly men and women process things differently, process emotions, hold emotions differently. And there's a lot of different reasons: biology, chemistry inside of our bodies, things like that. So what are some of the practical takeaways that people, men or women, can take away for how to have better relationships, knowing that we are actually different in how we process emotions?
Yes. So first I'll start with my message to the ladies. It's that all the emotions you feel, which seem so like, hello, of course, men don't feel that. Men will feel heightened states of emotion wherein their emotional processing and memory becomes just as sharp as a lady's under really two circumstances. When they feel that there is a physical existential threat to safety or security, such as an angry person or an intimidating person or someone who looks shady. And the other is when ladies, their mate threatens seriously to leave them. Mm. Those are the two situations that a man's emotional memory processing starts to become sharper, far sharper. Outside of that, not a whole lot, really. And it's kind of, I don't want to say it's depressing, but it's, so if it's, men forgetting anniversaries, the notorious, or women will set the password for something as the anniversary, and a guy will be like, hey, what's the password? And she'll be like, oh, it's our anniversary. And she'll just sit there and wait for him to put it in. And he's sitting there sweating bullets. I'm not going to say it's not our fault. Okay, an anniversary, we should commit that to memory. But the emotional memory surrounding these things, you've told me for years that you were sick and throwing up on our wedding day. I don't remember that. I remember that we stayed at the Hermitage Hotel.
Mm-hmm. And that's it.
I remember that. So I remember I had a Ford F-150. I doubt you care
the important
about,
things.
Right? That you crashed later. And I'm like.
No, I crashed before.
Oh, you crashed it before.
Before the wedding.
Crashed it before that. So men's emotional processing power as well as memory power is vastly lower. So ladies, please have some mercy. When you're like, I can't believe my husband, fill in the blank, doesn't feel that way, doesn't understand where I'm coming from, can't empathize. I cried my heart out and he just kind of patted me on the back and said, okay, that's enough. A response like that. And you're like, how can you be that way? The other takeaway, men can be very uncomfortable with overt displays of emotion. We don't feel empathetic emotional pain in others except for one thing can activate that. Women crying. Women crying can activate, not men crying. Women crying can activate our emotional pain centers pretty sharply so that we actually start to pay emotional attention to the situation at hand. Often an emotional situation will develop, let's say a discussion between, two married people at dinner. And the discussion is terribly upsetting the woman, whatever it is. And there's just this emotional buildup that another woman would see from a mile away. She'd be like, that woman's about to break down in tears. I can see it 5 minutes in advance. Mm-hmm. And then the man is like, what? Huh? Why are you crying? What's going on? I think that's happened to us a few times. Where you'll just kind of burst out in tears over something. And I'm like, whoa, what happened? What's going on here? What did I say? What did we do? So yeah, the things that activate a man's emotional brain are fewer and much further between. Mm. You can get it activated, but just have some patience and mercy with us. And also a lot of times when we seem upset, so oftentimes women will start to, let's say they're riding in the car, they're going home from date night and the man's completely quiet and he seems angry or perturbed. Many times women will go an emotional spiral. Mm-hmm. He's mad at me. All these things, it's just spiraling in the other chair. And the whole time he's thinking, why won't the boat start? I tried to get it started yesterday. It wouldn't start. I checked the gas. It's good. I changed the oil. It's good. And so he's going through his head something that is completely unrelated to you. Yeah. And he's aggravated about it because he wants the boat to start. Just thinking about it, I start getting aggravated. Why won't this hypothetical non-existent boat get started? I'm mad and it's not even a real thing. Mm-hmm. And And clear communication can help clear that up.
Yeah.
You know, saying things like, are there any, like, is there anything you need to talk about, or things like that. The other thing that I would caution women, oftentimes they will be angry at their man and they'll want him to figure it out. I would highly encourage women not to do that. Don't be like, I'm going to try to give him the silent treatment or act annoyed with him, and he better figure it out and get it, you know, and if he cares, he'll put in the effort to figure it out. Again, his ability to figure out is going to be far lower. Emotions are not our forte. I had a conversation with my brother-in-law, who was a special forces in 5th group. And he was opening up that at the end of his military career, he started to go to a psychologist. And he learned that there are lots of ways to express emotion that he did not know about before.
Yeah.
You know, 20 years in special forces, well, close to 20 years special forces, 20 years in the Army. He just always, like, when it came to emotions, like, either I'm fine or I'm not fine. Mm-hmm. Like, those are the two. Fine, not fine, black and white. And, you know, the man went more or less like 40 years of his life with that emotional processing, very binary. Good, not good. I feel fine. And his psychologist would throw a pillow at him that had like a lot of different emotions on there and color coded and all this stuff. And she'd say, fine is not an emotion. Pick one from the pillow. And he would have to be like, oh, I'm, you know, annoyed, or I feel elated, or whatever. Lots of different emotions. And kind of learning to express that. But for men, it doesn't come naturally. We have to have somebody like teach us.
Mm-hmm. But do you think part of this is also because boys tend to be told to suppress their emotions younger more than girls?
So there is kind of this pressure to suppress emotions on some level. I believe, my hypothesis is that the societal expectation of emotional suppression, at least among males, there is kind of this innate thing within us that we encourage one another to do that on some level, especially when we're young. If another boy starts to cry, we will gather around and make fun of him. It's girls, they'll gather around, they'll sit next to, they'll give a hug, they'll kiss boo-boos and stuff. Boys will be like, look at the crybaby, you know? And so we do start to suppress that. We also, when you look at the emotional development of boys versus girls, the kind of the stoic poker face that young men develop is kind of a defense mechanism against girls being able to read their emotions too strongly. And in an ironic twist of fate, we don't get the ability to process emotions as good, but we get the ability, a greater ability, to suppress the expression of our emotions so that people can't read them as much.
Yeah.
And it's not, there's even this cultural, it's not even just cultural. I think there's almost an innate where men place value on another man's ability to hold a poker face. It's respected. Like, that guy stays cool under pressure. At least he looks cool on the exterior, even if there's chaos going on inside. And we tend to exhort that. We tend to compliment that and respect that in other men.
Well, I think that's true of the expectation of anyone in a leadership position.
I do think that's true.
And I think that typically, because men are like the leaders of their homes, and historically they've been more of leaders in the workplace and things like that, I could see that. But even, you know, as me being CEO, probably one of the hardest things for me to do is suppress emotions in times of need. But that's what's needed for the company. But it doesn't come as naturally to me because as a woman, like, I tend to share my emotions and talk through them and wear them on my sleeve. And I think that upbringing does have a bit to do with this. Like, there's definitely going to be some women that were chastised for their emotions or some boys that were encouraged in their emotions. And so we're going to have, you know, this isn't like a one size fits all, but the general purposes are that men struggle more with sharing emotions. Women tend to be more self-aware, but to develop intimacy, you need both people to be able to share emotions and be vulnerable with each other.
You do. You do. And men do tend to start, if they have a desire to, and there's some intentionality there, they can start to develop that as young as like their 20s. Unless they were literally raised in a household of psychologists who, during high school talk about all these things, it's probably not going to happen till at the earliest their 20s.
Or if their parents went through marriage helper.
Or if their parents, maybe not even then. However, I believe that many of us start to naturally experience this in our 30s and 40s. I started in my early 30s to really start paying attention to emotional nuance, the way it's expressed in other people, how to read it.
Mm. Yeah.
So, and I feel like it's just becoming more and more natural over the years as we go.
So what tips do you have specifically for men on how they can become more emotionally vulnerable to build intimacy in their relationships?
It's not, I'm not going to sit here and give men tips on how to be more emotionally vulnerable per se. I would simply say being in tune with your own emotions is of more importance. Honestly, and I can't, until I see a lot of convincing research otherwise, I'm not entirely convinced that men necessarily should just pour their heart out to just anyone. There should be the very trusted person. And honestly, if your spouse isn't trustworthy with your vulnerability and your emotions, I can't tell a man to go be vulnerable with his wife. I will be real. It has to be earned. I feel that you've earned it from me.
But how?
Safe. Hate to use the word safe space, but safe space. An emotional level where I can tell you things, I can express myself to you and not be judged, criticized, attacked.
Mm-hmm.
That's what earns that. And so if you're a man and you have a wife who you can go to and she won't try to use it against you in any way, shape, or form, there won't be the judgment, she won't lose respect for you, then in that case, yeah, I think being emotionally vulnerable is fine. My message to men is be very selective about who you're emotionally vulnerable with. It's usually a male, either best friend or mentor or father.
Let's circle back here. So, but if the man is married,
okay,
and we know that emotional vulnerability and emotional intimacy is key to a healthy marriage.
Yes.
Who goes first?
Both spouses need to go first with setting a safe place. Imagine that the emotional vulnerability you talk about is like crops growing out of a field. You have to set the field. It has to be cleared. You can't have weeds, can't have trees, can't have bushes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You have to plow it. You have to make sure that it's soft, good. It has to be rich in nutrients and things. You don't want to, you have to water it and all that. So that's kind of the safe space. That's creating a safe space.
Mm-hmm.
And then with the knowledge in hand that this person is safe, seeds can get planted. And a lot of times that comes in the form of a test. Men will often test the water, a little bit of vulnerability. Let's see what happens. A little bit of sharing. Let's see how she treats this thing that I'm giving her.
Well, that's
here.
the bricks, right? You
bricks.
share one brick and you see how it's handled.
That's like seeds being planted in the field that hopefully is ready to raise up good, healthy crops. And the field would be the safe space. And the actual crops is the intimacy. It's the vulnerability that you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I actually my message to men would be, you do need a person that you can authentically express yourself to. Hopefully that is your spouse. It might not be. I don't think you should just run off and divorce your spouse if she's not that safe space yet. But find like a male mentor. Don't find a woman unless it's like your mom. Because then there's kind of the opening of having affairs and things, that you'll become emotionally attached to another woman if she is a safe place. But find like a man who's a mentor, a best friend, your father, an uncle, grandfather, who you can express vulnerability to. I know that I can express vulnerability to my dad. He may not be super expressive in response, but I know that he cares.
Yeah.
And he won't judge me.
Yeah. I would say that if a wife is not an emotionally safe space, then the first question I would ask the husband would be, have you been toward her?
Probably not.
And that's the place to start. Like, how can you make sure? And so I do think in some areas, the man has to be the one to lead. Like what you were saying, like share some things. And maybe at first your wife won't respond super great, but if you can just begin doing it and then notice when she shares things with you, how are you responding back? And then you kind of help set the tone for that in the future. I mean, that's the only way, because you can't just avoid it. You can't avoid, because your marriage will never be good if you just avoid becoming emotionally vulnerable with each other.
Yes. And the bricks analogy is good. For those who aren't aware, there's a wall and brick analogy that Marriage Helper uses to illustrate vulnerability and being vulnerable with others. I'm just going to skip to the part where we talked about how when we first start sharing intimate details about ourselves with others, it's like handing them a brick and we want to see what they do. Do they throw it back at us? Or do they treasure it? Imagine now, let's say there's a group project and you guys are trying to build something together. Maybe you take those bricks and you're not building walls anymore, but now you're going to build a house together, like an emotional home for the both of you to live in. And you're using the bricks of your the intimacy that you share with one another, those details, those vulnerabilities. What's going to be faster? If I hand you a brick and I sit and I have to wait a while to see what you do with it, I have to thoroughly analyze what you do with that brick before I hand you another one. But if we're at a point where I thoroughly trust you with every brick I hand you, then it's just like I'm handing you brick after brick after brick in a row, and we're building this house together. So what you talked about with setting the safe space, once it's set really well between the two of you, then yeah, you can expect like cascading vulnerability from both people. And that's the cool thing about the workshop. You see people on day 3 are able to achieve that remarkably fast through a lot of breakthroughs. And the amount of intimacy is just like intimacy overload of people being totally vulnerable with one another. And the workshop has a lot of forcing functions, sharing life stories and things of that nature, that causes so many couples who never could really understand one another to suddenly be completely immersed in the other person's world and see things through their lens and to have empathy for the first time in 20 years of marriage. It can happen remarkably fast. Miraculously fast at times. If people are intentional, if the right things are set up. I guess the takeaway is go to the 3-day workshop.
All that
Put a nice plug in there. Today's episode was brought to you by the 3-day workshop from Marriage Helper at marriagehelper.com.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, you can start with some of the easier things like, how was your day? What are your dreams for the future? What are some things that are currently making you angry or that you're passionate about? And just use that as opportunities to speak and connect. And the key is not trying to force another person to believe or react or feel or think a certain way, but letting whatever their emotion is be their emotion and just sitting with them there in it. I mean, that's really the key to building this from the ground up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, going back to takeaways, I feel like we started really good with just kind of the foundational building blocks of here's just kind of how brains work. And we got into selling people the workshop.
Emotions.
Selling people the workshop. That's the important thing. Emotion, like intimacy, vulnerability. And it's kind of like it's like a ladder. So we start at the bottom. Men and women process emotion vastly different from one another.
Mm-hmm.
The emotional lens by which we see the world is totally different.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine having a different set of eyes put into your head. You're still perceiving the same world, but it may look completely different to you. Men and women have two very distinct sets of eyes. There can be overlap. There can be outliers and exceptions, men who are very emotionally expressive, women who are very stoic. Some of that could be nature, some of that could be nurture. But generally, as a general matter, speaking as a matter of statistical averages, men, not super emotionally, I hate to say we're not super emotionally intelligent, but we lag behind women on social and emotional intelligence. We can catch up with effort. But we have to try. Women, very adept. It's very natural. It's just kind of this like, of course I'm upset about that. Why doesn't he see it?
Yeah.
So the practical takeaway for that is women, just have some patience with your man. That then rolls into practical applications for both men and women, which is set up emotionally safe places for one another. Both men and women are bad at that in different ways. I feel like men, we're just generally bad at it. Like safe place doesn't come naturally to us. Often we, especially among men, we tease one another. We can make fun of one another. We rib one another.
You downplay emotions.
We downplay emotions. We'll make fun of emotions. And I discovered pretty early on in marriage, like, you don't do that with women.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think another key part of it is realizing maybe when your wife says that she's emotionally hurt by something, you should listen to it.
Yeah.
Because she's more emotionally in tune and adept.
Yes.
So don't discount it.
Yes, absolutely. Don't discount one another's emotions.
I remember the first part of our marriage, your tone. It was always your tone. And I would say
Very harsh
things. I was like, Rob, your tone. And you would just say, what tone? I don't have a tone. It was like, you have, it's like, but it's your tone. And you've gotten so much better at that over the years.
Yeah.
But it was so frustrating at first because it was like every time you would respond to something that I would, like when I would come to you, and I couldn't get you to hear it. I couldn't get you to care about it. Yeah. But it was so deeply impacting me. Yeah. And so that's another key part. Like, your wives are telling you the things that they're frustrated about. But are you listening?
Yes. Pay attention to that. Mm-hmm. You know, I was a soldier, the son of a soldier, the son of a drill sergeant, raised by a man who had been a drill sergeant in the Army. I then became an officer and a pilot. I remember doing run-up drills it was like a fake cockpit of a helicopter. The instructor sat in the back with a stick, mm-hmm. and he would just hit us.
Oh my gosh.
Not so much to cause like any kind of permanent maiming. It was just enough to sting. Like if you screwed up, like you get whacked. And you went about learning. And the instructors, just every instructor I had would more or less talk to you kind of with a somewhat harsh tone. Like it's just, so not an excuse. I just didn't know much better. And I learned that interacting with other people like that takes a toll on their emotions, especially women. Mm-hmm. Think of an emotional, like when it comes to emotional processing and emotional storage, think of superhighway, like superhighways, like 5-6 lane highways that connects more or less like Fulfillment by Amazon sized warehouses of emotional storage. And it's this gigantic matrix of information. That's mm-hmm. the other thing about women. There's a matrix of information. That a little detail over here about, you know, your wedding day can somehow tie into this thing over here that's 20 years removed. Mm-hmm. And it makes sense to women. Men often aren't that kind of matrix. When it comes to emotional processing, it's like country roads. When it comes to emotional storage, it's like just a rundown shack with Bubba in the back, putting stuff on the shelves, and they fall off quite frequently. So just understanding those differences, having mercy with each other in the different ways. Yeah. Men, we often have to have mercy with our tone, with our anger. Anger is one of the few emotions we can usually readily identify pretty easily. I'm angry. I'm horny. That's like the two main emotions, and you have some like tertiary emotions surrounding that. Hungry, which usually goes into anger. I'm hangry. So, what if you're hungry, angry, and horny? How does that? Horngry?
I don't think we should say the word.
I just made that trademark.
Right
trademark there. Horngry. So, practical takeaways: just have mercy with one another. Have mercy. And if you're struggling with intimacy, you're struggling with getting to know one another, and maybe you both fundamentally want safe spaces for each other, but you're struggling to really do that, go to the workshop. Call into Marriage Helper, go to the workshop. I will shamelessly plug that all day, every day. It works. It helps people.
It does. It does. I think those are good takeaways. Good episode. Until next week.
Stay strong.
There you go.